I'm here to present Dr. Logan Fiorella as he presents his award talk today as the 2020 winner of the Richard E. Snow Award for Early Career Contributions. The Richard E. Snow Award is the prestigious award given each year by Division 15 to a scholar who has completed his or her doctoral work within the past 10 years and has made significant research contributions to the field of educational psychology. Logan is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Georgia. He has won numerous awards and honors, including the Rising Star Award by the Owens Institute for the Behavioral Research at the University of Georgia, and the Outstanding Early Career Scholar Award from ARA's Division C. His research has been supported by over $5 million of external grants and fellowships, including Division 15's own dissertation research grant in 2014. He has authored or co-authored 2 books, 10 book chapters, 29 journal articles since earning his PhD in 2015 from the University of California, Santa Barbara. I am introducing Dr. Fiorella today on behalf of the committee chair, Dr. Andrew Elliott, and the rest of the committee, Drs. Akane Zusho, Mimi Bong, Krista Mewis, and Reinhard Peckrin. They have shared this glowing excerpt from the nomination letter written by Dr. Richard Mayer for me to read. Dr. Fiorella is interested in applying the science of learning to improving education, particularly in improving the design of computer-supported instruction and the role of learning strategies. His work has both a theoretical goal of contributing to our understanding of how people learn, a major focus in cognitive psychology, and a practical goal of developing research-based principles for the design of computer-based instruction and learning strategy instruction, a major focus in educational psychology. Dr. Fiorella has shown himself to be an amazingly productive and brilliant researcher who has an unquenchable intellectual curiosity and a knack for creating powerful experimental designs. Congratulations, Logan. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Carla, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining today. So much of my research has focused on how students make sense of what they're learning so that they can take what they've learned and apply it to new situations. And so one way to do that is to use what we call generative learning activities. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by generative learning. I'll give some examples of different types of generative activities. And then I'll go through a few research studies that we've done in the last few years, trying to address kind of how generative activities work and when they work best. So I'll start with an example just to illustrate what I mean by generative learning. This is a paragraph taken from a lesson on the human circulatory system. You can just go ahead and just take a moment and read through it and just kind of pay attention to what goes on in your mind as you are trying to make sense of it. I'll give you a second to look at this. Okay, so one of the things you likely noticed is a verbal component to sense making, where you essentially are trying to explain the text to yourself by using your existing knowledge to generate inferences and fill in gaps. So in the first sentence, when it says the right side, you can infer that it's referring to the right side of the heart, or when it says the blood is oxygen poor, you might infer that that's because the oxygen was dropped off in the body, and so on. So there's a lot of information that students need to be able to generate from the text in order to make sense of it. But you might have also noticed a visual component to sense making. So while you were reading, you may have kind of imagined what the circulatory system looks like, the different structures, how they relate to each other. And this is likely happening simultaneously. So these two modes of sense making, you're kind of talking to yourself, you're sort of forming an image of what you're reading, and you're relating these two representations to each other with the goal of trying to develop a coherent mental representation or a mental model of how the system works. Of course, if a student doesn't have sufficient background knowledge to generate these relationships, the text just simply won't make sense, right? But even if we assume that students do have sufficient background knowledge to make sense of a text like this, they may not spontaneously engage in these kinds of sense-making processes, and therefore they may need explicit prompting and guidance to support that. And that's where generative learning activities come in. So Generative activities are really just ways of getting students to overtly engage in sense-making processes. So we can prompt students to explain what they're learning, either to themselves or by teaching other students. Or on the visualizing side, we can ask students to generate external visualizations like drawing the physical structures of a system, or generating more abstract visual representations like concept maps or graphic organizers. And our prior reviews of the literature on generative activities generally indicate that these strategies are highly effective. So prompting students to explain or to visualize when they're learning generally leads to better understanding than control groups of students who are not prompted and instead rely on their own strategies. So it suggests that students generally don't use these strategies spontaneously, and that prompting can be beneficial. But my research has tried to go beyond testing whether individual strategies are effective and instead focusing on how they work and when they work best. So today I'm going to focus on 3 research questions that we've tried to address in the last several years regarding how generative activities work. So the first question is has to do with the complementary relationship between these different types of activities. So in particular, is one of the functions of creating drawings to help students explain the material to themselves and then lead to better understanding. So how do drawing and explaining strategies kind of sort of relate to each other and support each other? The second question has to do with when we should have students study provided visual representations versus generate their own. So how can we kind of combine the use of both approaches to get the best of both worlds? And the last study that I'll talk about focuses on how we can apply these activities to learning from video lessons, which obviously is something that we've all become more interested in over the last couple of years. So in this first study, we looked at the relationship between drawing and explaining activities, and in particular, whether drawing can help students explain things in words more effectively. And part of the rationale for this study is that when we prompt students to explain things, especially when they're explaining to others, there's a tendency to engage in what's often called knowledge telling, where they simply just repeat straight from the lesson without generating inferences, without elaborating. And we know from other research that external visualizations are a great way to get students to generate more inferences and elaborate on the learning material. And in this study, we wanted to see if learner-generated visualizations would help students generate their own explanations more effectively. So the way we did that was we had undergraduates from the University of Georgia study a lesson on the human respiratory system, and then they were asked to teach that lesson or give a video recorded lecture as if they were teaching another student. They weren't actually teaching, but they were explaining as if they were going to teach a student who doesn't know anything about how the system works. So the way this study worked was we had all students study the same text lesson on the respiratory system, and then they were randomly assigned to one of 4 conditions. In one condition, they just explained orally on video, teaching their hypothetical peer how the respiratory system works. Another condition, the draw-only condition, they created a drawing on paper while they were being recorded. And the drawing was intended to teach their student. And the third condition, this is the critical condition where we had students create a drawing as they were simultaneously explaining aloud. So does the act of being able to externalize one's knowledge in the form of a visual help students kind of free them up to elaborate more in their explanations, and does that lead to better understanding? And we have a 4th restudy condition where they did not teach, but they got additional time studying the learning material. And this is just an example student drawing from the Explain and Draw group, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. And after the teaching phase of the experiment, all students came back to the lab a week later and completed a series of post-tests assessing their understanding of how the respiratory system works. So here I'll present the performance on across the 4 conditions on each of the 3 post-tests that we gave students a week after teaching. So the retention test just asked students to basically recall facts straight from the lesson. The drawing test had students draw specific elements of the respiratory system, and the transfer test required students to apply their knowledge to a new situation. But in this study, the results were quite consistent across all three measures, where you can see that the explain only and the draw only conditions generally outperformed the restudy condition on the three measures. So that's consistent with prior research on generative activities, that prompting students to explain or to draw is effective. But then we get this added boost of explaining and drawing. And if you look at the effect sizes, it's a pretty big boost. So this is just overall across the three measures. There's a huge effect size compared to the restudy condition, but there's still a medium to a large effect size for the explain and draw condition against explaining only or drawing only. So there's a pretty significant additional benefit beyond just using one strategy on its own. So then we looked at, we tried to understand, okay, why is there this benefit of drawing while explaining? So we looked at the quality of students' explanations during the teaching phase. And as we expected, the students who explained and drew generated twice as many or more than twice as many elaborative statements in their explanations than the explain only condition. So an elaborative statement would be something, anything that went significantly beyond the content of the lesson, incorporated students' existing knowledge. So if somebody generated an analogy saying something like the capillaries are like little nets, okay, that would be an elaborative statement that wasn't explicit in the lesson. And when we statistically account for the role of elaborations, we see that the benefit of explaining and drawing on the post-test measures was partially mediated by the number of elaborations that students generated while teaching. So basically, drawing while explaining led to more elaborative statements in their explanations, which was associated with better performance. And so in this study, drawing did in fact seem to facilitate explaining, which led to better understanding. In this second example, this area of research, we've focused on kind of the strengths and weaknesses of providing students with representations or visual representations and asking them to generate them themselves. So past research comparing these two approaches has kind of yielded mixed results, which isn't really surprising because they both have kind of unique strengths and weaknesses. So in this study, we had undergraduates, again, from the University of Georgia. They studied a text on the human circulatory system. So all the students studied the same text. And then some students received a provided visual like the one on the left there. And other students were asked to generate their own visual from the text. And this is an example on the right. And then we have other students who got some combination of both approaches. So in total, there were 4 conditions in this experiment. The provided only group, they studied the text and they were only provided with visuals. They did not draw. So in this case, they're ensured that they get an accurate representation. But we know from prior research that students sometimes approach provided visuals a bit passively if they're not prompted to do anything with the visual. So that's a potential downside. The generated only group, they received the same text and created their drawing from the text, which is a generative process because they have to create the visual incorporating their existing knowledge. But we know when students are prompted to draw like this without any additional support, they often generate inaccurate or at least lower quality drawings. And then we have these 2 combined conditions where we varied the sequence of whether students first received the provided visual, and then that was taken away and they were asked to generate their own visual. In that case, the provided visual kind of served as a scaffold. But one of the potential downsides there is that now they might be just kind of copying what they saw. So drawing is kind of serving a different function there. And then the 4th condition, which we expected to be the most effective because it kind of incorporates the best elements of both approaches, is that we had students generate the drawing from the text, and then later receive a provided visual as feedback. So now they have the opportunity to translate the text into their own visual first, which we know is generally an effective strategy. And then they also get the provided visual as feedback. So then they have something to compare their drawing to in order to kind of improve or make any modifications to their mental model. So when I show the results here, I'm going to show you the performance across the 4 conditions on both a retention test and a transfer test. And so to plot them on the same graph here, these are z-scores. For retention, we didn't really see anything across the conditions. There's no significant differences across the 4 conditions on just their ability to recall specific facts from the lesson. But when we look at transfer, we see a very different pattern, and mostly in line with what we expected, where the provided only group performs the worst on transfer, whereas the generated provided group performs the best. Now, one potential explanation is that, at least in this study, simply providing them with a visual didn't guarantee that students were actively processing or trying to make sense of the visual. So just that alone wasn't very effective. And that's the only condition that didn't actually draw. Then you look at the other conditions, the generated only group, they drew, but they never received any feedback. So their drawing quality was relatively low in that condition. And then the third group, the provided generated group, they saw the provided visual, but we suspect they didn't necessarily process it that deeply. And then they were asked to draw after they'd already seen the visual. And now drawing kind of serves as more of a reproduction activity where they might be trying to just reproduce what they saw rather than a generative activity where they're actively trying to interpret the text. And then the fourth condition, as we expected, this group performed the best because they first had to generate their drawing from the text without a visual provided. So that forced them to integrate the text with their existing knowledge. And then they could compare their drawing to the provided visual. So in other words, drawing first might have prepared them to benefit more from the provided visual, whereas in other cases, students may only study provided visuals relatively passively. So this study suggests that a combination of both approaches can yield the strongest benefits, especially when students generate their drawings first. And then this last example, we looked at the application of generative activities to video lessons. So part of the rationale for this study is that in the drawing research, often students are learning from text. So they're given a text and they're asked to translate the text into their own visual, which can be effective as we saw in the other studies. But a lot of instruction, and obviously in video instruction, relies heavily on instructor provided visuals. So drawing may not be as effective when the instructional materials contain a lot of instructor provided visuals already, just like we saw in the prior study. In contrast, a lot of research suggests that explaining is a really effective strategy when learning from visuals. And that's kind of similar to the first study where drawing was facilitative of explaining. So in this kind of context, we might expect that explaining is going to be more effective than drawing. So in this study, we had undergraduates watch a 5-part lesson on the human kidney, as you're seeing here. And after each part of the lesson, they either wrote an explanation of that part that they just watched, or they drew a diagram of whatever they just saw, or they rewatched that part of the video. So that was a restudy condition. And the results were in line with what we expected. This is kind of a simplification of the results just for time, but basically the explain condition outperformed the other 2 conditions on the transfer test, but there was no benefit of drawing. And we suspect that at least in the way that this was implemented, students who were tasked with drawing now kind of approach it as, okay, I saw these visuals in the video and now you're asking me to draw. So they're just kind of trying to reproduce what they saw. Whereas explaining is more of a generative activity in this context because they saw provided visuals and now they're asked to kind of interpret what they saw and sort of translate from visual to a verbal representation. So that might be one explanation for why explaining in this particular context was more effective than drawing. Okay, so just some implications from some of this work. The first broad implication is that we probably shouldn't assume that students will spontaneously engage in sense making, and that's kind of the rationale for prompting students to engage in generative activities. The first study provide some implications for understanding kind of the complementary nature of these representations, or these learner-generated representations, which is very much in line with other research from multimedia learning on the complementary role of provided verbal and visual representations. The second study I talked about looked at trying to combine the strengths of provided and visual and generated representations, suggesting that having students generate the visuals first from text and then comparing to a provided visual might be the most effective combination. And then a theme that runs through all of these studies and other research is the benefit of translating across representations. So in the first study, students benefited from using their drawings, their own drawings, to generate higher quality explanations. In the second study, it was most effective when students first used a provided text to generate their own visual before seeing the provided visual. And in the third study, explaining was most effective in a context where the lesson was heavily reliant on provided visualization. So this translation process across visualization seems to be a key theme that might be contributing to the benefits we see. Whereas when students are not translating, but explaining a verbal representation or drawing after seeing a visual representation, they may be more inclined to just simply copy or knowledge tell in those types of contexts rather than incorporate their existing knowledge. So with that, I want to thank all of my collaborators on the research that I talked about here today. Rich Mayer, collaborator and former advisor, Andy Stoll at UCSB, and my former PhD student, Shelby Coleman, and my current PhD student, Chen Zhang. Funding and support from the University of Georgia. And thank you all for your attention.